3 months after the surprise Japanese attack on Port Arthur, the Russian Pacific Squadron remains bottled up in the harbor, under blockade from the Japanese combined fleet. Russia's great strength is supposed to be its army, the largest in the world. But with sea supremacy, the Japanese are now deploying soldiers into Manchuria faster than the Russians can. The Russians need a win, at sea or on land, but somewhere, and soon. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 32, Red Sun Rising. Last week, we discussed the opening weeks of the Russo-Japanese War in early 1904, mostly focused on the naval fighting between Japan and Russia at Port Arthur. We'll continue that story today, but I want to circle around a bit and get caught up in what's going on in the land war. As I emphasized last week, since Japan is an archipelago, its ability to place troops and fight on the Asian mainland is dependent on maintaining sea superiority in the waters between the home islands and continental Asia. Hence the emphasis in the naval war on either destroying the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, or at least in confining it to the port. The Russians don't need sea superiority to conduct the war. They already have 100,000 soldiers in Manchuria, and are shipping more soldiers and supplies eastward every day on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The highest-ranking officer in the theater is Yevgeny Ivanovich Alexeyev. Alexeyev was the illegitimate son of the Emperor Alexander II, the current emperor's grandfather. That makes him Nikolai's uncle. Alexeyev had a long military career and held the rank of admiral in the Navy. Just a few months before the war broke out, the emperor had appointed Alexeyev his viceroy in the Far East. Alexeyev was one of the most outspoken of the hawks that I mentioned last episode, who supported Russian moves into Korea and were unafraid of a potential confrontation with Japan. What's confusing about the viceroy thing is that as a viceroy, Alexeyev is theoretically ruling the Far East in the emperor's name, which means that he answers to no one but the emperor himself, stands above and apart from all military chains of command, which in turn implies that he is commander-in-chief of all land and naval forces in the theater. But the emperor never made clear exactly what the limits to Alexeyev's authority might be, if any, and the fact that he was only viceroy for a few months before the war broke out meant that he and the military commanders in the Far East had not had time enough to get to know each other and hammer out among themselves who was in charge of what. The Russian Minister of War at this time was Alexei Nikolaevich Kuropatkin. Kuropatkin had been involved in the unsuccessful negotiations with the Japanese prior to the war, and as part of that effort, he had visited Japan in 1903. This made him one of the few Imperial Russian ministers who ever actually set foot in Japan, let alone had the opportunity to inspect Japanese military units. His conclusion was that the Japanese army was every bit the equal of the Russian army, and he returned home opposed to war with Japan. Kuropatkin resigned as war minister after Alexeyev was appointed viceroy of the Far East, but, ironically, he would be put in command of the war that he had opposed. In March 1904, Kuropatkin set up his headquarters at Liaoyang, a Chinese city on the Liaodong Peninsula, and took stock of the situation. Kuropatkin decided early on that the Russian army in Manchuria, for all its numbers, was poorly equipped, poorly deployed, and generally unprepared for a war with Japan. His preferred strategy was delay, keep the Japanese bottled up where possible, and where not possible, Slow them down as much as you can until the Trans-Siberian Railroad can bring Russia's enormous power to bear. It was a reasonable strategy, but the emperor and the viceroy were not nearly as patient as Kuropatkin was, and they were always on him to do more and to fight harder. Last week, I described Japanese landings in Korea, and at the end of the episode, the Japanese First Army, 42,000 strong, was assembled in Korea and marching north. By mid-April, Russian cavalry units had tried and failed to harass the First Army in northern Korea and had withdrawn back across the Yalu River, the border between Korea and Manchuria. The Japanese commanders were as aware as Kuropatkin was that time was on the Russian side. So they wanted to get across the river into Manchuria as quickly as possible. Kuropatkin had assigned the job of opposing the Japanese First Army advance to General Mikhail Ivanovich Zasulich, commander of the 2nd Siberian Army Corps. This was a force of about 26,000, barely more than half the size of the Japanese First Army. Kuropatkin had very sensibly instructed Zasulich that this would be a delaying action. The combination of the river crossing and the rough terrain would have made it possible for Zasulich to withdraw steadily north into Manchuria, harassing and delaying the First Army as they advanced. Zasulich, however, could not imagine that the Japanese could possibly win a battle against Russians, and in this he was encouraged by Viceroy Alexeyev. So Zasulich disobeyed orders and hunkered down for an all-out defense along the Yalu River. He got it into his head, somehow, that the Japanese crossing was going to take place at the Chinese border town of Andong. Andong lies at the lower end of the Yalu River, almost at the delta. This is where the river crossing would be easiest, and it was the most obvious place. But the Japanese, who had fought their way across the Yalu River once before in the war against China 10 years ago and knew the way very well, were actually planning to cross further upstream at the Korean town of Uiju. The Japanese were masterful in keeping their intention secret, using trees and bushes and cropland as cover. The Russians, by contrast, made no effort to hide their positions, a weakness that was only exacerbated by the Japanese use of scouts who dressed as Korean or Chinese fishermen along the river and spied on the Russians. Zasulich's deployment made it clear where he thought the Japanese were going to cross the river. So the Japanese took full advantage of this situation by making a big show of constructing a bridge across the river just where Zasulich expected them to. Russian artillery opened up on the Japanese engineers immediately. The Japanese brought in gunboats up the river to suppress the Russian artillery, just as you would expect them to if this was the real river crossing. But in fact, the real river crossing proceeded upstream, and the Japanese were across the river and moving against the Russian left flank. Even when his subordinates reported that the Japanese were attacking the left flank, Zasulich continued to insist that this was a feint and the real attack was coming at Andong. The Japanese main attack began on April 30th. The Japanese opened up on the Russians with their own far superior 4.7-inch Krupp howitzers, the best in the world, and put the Russian artillery out of commission in a matter of minutes. Soon the Russians were outflanked and in danger of becoming surrounded. They were forced to retreat, but the units were now so disorganized that they were unable to reform their defenses on the hills behind the river, meaning that Zasulich would not be able to carry out the kind of delaying action he'd been ordered to, and he was forced into an all-out retreat north into Manchuria. This was a major victory for the Japanese for several reasons. First of all, this was the first time in the modern era that an Asian army had defeated a European one. The world was put on notice that Japan is a major power, and it meant business. Even the most blinkered racist would have to sit up and take notice. Of course, they all did what blinkered racists do, which is shift seamlessly from, "The Japanese? Are you kidding me?" mode into full-blown, yellow peril mode. Second, when the Japanese proved that they were indeed a major power, the financial markets of London and New York began underwriting Japanese bonds. This was crucial, as the war effort was a tremendous drain on what was still a small economy. Financing was critical, and now the Japanese had it. Third, the Japanese had, in effect, opened up a new front. Until now, Russian attention was focused on Port Arthur, all the way down at the southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula. Now, with Zasulich disorganized and in retreat, an entire Japanese army is coming at them from the east, threatening that all-important rail line from Harbin down to Port Arthur. Soldiers and resources would have to be diverted to the east to guard against this threat. As it turns out, though, the advance of the First Army across the Yalu River is mostly a diversion. Just as Kuropatkin and the Russian army are turning their attention away from the Liaodong Peninsula, the Japanese Second Army is poised to invade it. At the end of last week's episode, I left us at a dramatic juncture in the narrative. A fleet of Japanese transports is on its way to the Liaodong Peninsula to make an amphibious assault. Admiral Togo, assigned the task of sinking obsolete merchant ships in the entrance to Port Arthur Harbor so that the Russian Pacific Squadron wouldn't be able to interfere, has failed his assignment. But he lied. He sent a false report to his superiors that the operation had been a success and the invasion went forward as planned. Why did Togo lie? He knew that if he reported failure, the invasion would be called off and it would be his fault. Whether it was the first or the second of these things that bothered him more, I couldn't tell you. But if he reported success and the invasion went forward, it was still likely to succeed. Togo would have judged, correctly, that the recent death of the beloved Admiral Makarov would demoralize and paralyze the Pacific Squadron. Pending a replacement, the Pacific Squadron was now under the direct command of the Viceroy, Alexeyev, who had come to Port Arthur in person to take charge. Also, even if the Russians did send reconnaissance ships out of Port Arthur and did discover the invasion fleet, it was iffy whether or not those reconnaissance ships would ever make it back to Port Arthur to report. And if they did, and even if the entire Pacific Squadron did sortie to intercept the invasion, there were still several squadrons of Japanese destroyers in the area. Of course, this was a risky gamble. If the Russians did manage to intercept the invasion, potentially thousands of Japanese soldiers would be killed, and the fault would lie squarely on Togo. He would go down in Japanese history as the lying liar who lost us the war with his lying. But the gamble paid off. The Pacific Squadron stayed put, and the landing, on May 5th, was a success. The Japanese chose to invade at a point on the peninsula about 30 miles north of Dalny. Kuropatkin, distracted by the advancing First Army, had no forces available to oppose the landing. On May 13th, the Second Army reached the rail line. One of the last trains out of Port Arthur carried the Viceroy, Alexeyev, whom the Emperor had ordered to relocate to Liaoyang. Port Arthur was now cut off by land as well as by sea. But the month of May was a nervous time for Admiral Togo. Supplies and reinforcements were pouring into the Japanese bridgehead on the peninsula, and it was vital that the Pacific Squadron stayed put. To make sure of that, Togo began sending patrols closer in to Port Arthur, where they would be plainly visible to the Russians, as a way of intimidating them. The new commander of the Pacific Squadron, Admiral Wilhelm Karlovich Wittgeft, who, as you might have guessed from his name, was an ethnic German from Odessa, had no intention of leaving the port. In fact, once Port Arthur was cut off by land, the defenders got to work removing some guns from the ships to bolster their land defenses. The only move Admiral Wittgeft took that you might call a naval offensive was in sending the Pacific Squadron's only remaining mine layer, the Amur, to lay new minefields outside the harbor entrance. But Togo didn't know any of this. His shows of force at Port Arthur did involve a certain measure of risk. During the month of May, the Japanese combined fleet lost 2 smaller ships to collisions and 3 smaller ships to mines. But the worst setback was on May 15th. The battleship Hatsuse struck a Russian mine and lost the ability to maneuver. Even worse, the battleship Yashima, moving in to assist, hit another mine. The helpless Hatsuse drifted for an hour and a half. Then it struck a second Russian mine and went down with 500 members of her crew in plain sight of Port Arthur. Other Japanese ships were able to evacuate Yashima's crew and tow her away, but she sank before they could get her back to port, although happily without loss of life. There was no keeping the loss of Hatsuse a secret, but the crew of Yashima were reassigned to other ships with instructions to continue to write letters home as if they were still serving aboard Yashima. And the Japanese, amazingly, managed to keep the loss of Yashima a secret for the rest of the war. But secret or not, the entire Japanese Navy is now down to just 4 battleships. There are more Russian battleships than that, just at Port Arthur, and more are on the way. Hang on, did you just say more are on the way? Yes, I did. The Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur, on paper, was large enough to take on the entire Japanese Navy by itself. But by the beginning of May, it was clear that, whatever the paper said, in practice, Admiral Togo was pretty much having everything his way. With the Japanese First Army coming north out of Korea, and the Second Army landing on the Liaodong Peninsula, Kuropatkin's strategy of just holding on until Russian reinforcements from Europe turned the tide wasn't looking so smart. The Japanese armies in Manchuria were getting reinforced faster than the Russian ones were. This was all according to the Japanese plan, of course, and it all depended on Japan maintaining sea superiority. But the Russian Navy has a lot more ships than just the Pacific Squadron. Too bad they're all in Europe. Take the Russian Baltic Fleet, for instance. The Baltic Fleet has historically been Russia's main battle fleet. Why, right then in 1904, 4 brand new Borodino-class battleships, newer than any of the Japanese battleships, have just joined the Baltic Fleet. If only there was some way of getting them to Port Arthur. But that's crazy talk. In our day of diesel and nuclear-powered ships, the idea that a major naval power might send a battle fleet to the other side of the world, it's not that far out there. But in 1904, it was insane. Coal-powered ships don't have anything like the range of modern warships, and their engines are much less reliable. A sea voyage from St. Petersburg to Port Arthur around the Cape of Good Hope would be 18,000 miles, and it would take months, even if the Russians had port facilities along the way where their ships could stop to rest, repair, and refuel, which they don't. But by May, it was beginning very much to look like the Japanese might take Manchuria before the Russians can get their massive armies redeployed to stop them. And so a plan was conceived. The commander of the Russian Baltic Fleet, a respected senior admiral, Zinovy Petrovich Rojdestvensky, was assigned the task of selecting a fleet of ships from those available in the Baltic to be optimistically dubbed the Second Pacific Squadron, and taking them around Africa and Asia to link up with the First Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur, and then to defeat Togo and cut off the Japanese supply line into Manchuria. It was a remarkable assignment. Rojdestvensky didn't want it, but the order came directly from the emperor. Rojdestvensky was a good choice. He was an able and respected admiral who had served under Makarov during the Russo-Turkish War. He had a reputation as a tough commander and was known for his explosive temper. Russian sailors called him the Mad Dog. Behind his back, of course. Rojdestvensky was skeptical of his chances for success, but he set to work selecting, training, and outfitting the Second Pacific Squadron. At first, he wanted to take a smaller fleet of exclusively newer and faster ships, but that idea was vetoed, and he got stuck with a larger fleet of slower and less reliable vessels. His target date to begin the voyage was July 15th, 10 weeks away. But in the end, it would take much, much longer to get the ships underway. Meanwhile, back on the Liaodong Peninsula, the Japanese Second Army has arrived. After cutting off the rail line, their first action was to move south toward the port of Dalny. The good news is, the Russians have only a small force of about 4,000 to oppose the Second Army, which now numbers about 35,000. The bad news is, the Russians have constructed strong fortifications supported by machine guns and barbed wire at the narrowest point on the peninsula, just 3 miles across. The Japanese attacked this fortified line on May 24th and 25th in what has come to be known as the Battle of Nanshan. And if anyone out there still hasn't gotten the message about frontal assaults on an entrenched enemy armed with modern weapons, pay attention. Although the Japanese had massive superiority in artillery and were supplemented with gunboats firing on the Russian flanks from the sea, 9 Japanese infantry assaults on the Russian position, yes, I said 9, all failed. But it is here that the Russians snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Although the commander on the scene, Colonel Nikolai Tretyakov, had conducted an able defense, by the end of the day his forces were running low on ammunition and had suffered 40% casualties. He was begging his superiors for reinforcements. But his superiors were afraid to send more troops into the battle. Russian soldiers were stationed all the way down the peninsula from Nanshan to Port Arthur. Having been caught by surprise by one Japanese amphibious landing, they were determined not to be caught by surprise by a second one. To the Russian command, sending those troops all the way up north to Nanshan would leave the door open for another invasion force to land somewhere on the peninsula behind them and surround the troops there. So, the Russian generals ordered a withdrawal. To the amazement of the Japanese, the Russians gave up their defensive line and the valuable port city of Dalny without further resistance. Dalny would become crucial in supplying the Japanese army on the Liaodong Peninsula. The Russians withdrew their troops all the way to Port Arthur. The siege has begun. The Battle of Nanshan cost the Japanese over 6,000 casualties, to the Russians 1,500. And if the casualty figures aren't shocking enough for you, check this out. When the Japanese High Command added up all the bills from the Battle of Nanshan, they discovered that the Second Army had expended more ammunition in one 2-day assault than Japan had spent in the entire Sino-Japanese War of just 10 years ago. Let me say that again. One battle cost Japan more ammunition than the entire war they had fought just 10 years ago. And so the Japanese were served to notice that war in the 20th century was going to be something quite different from anything anyone had seen before, and it gave the rest of the world a valuable lesson on how expensive and costly it would be to take an entrenched enemy position defended by barbed wire and machine guns. the world would completely and utterly fail to learn this lesson and would have to learn it all over again 10 years from now in 1914. Meanwhile, back at Vladivostok, remember Vladivostok? Spring had come. The bulk of Russia's Pacific Fleet is stationed at Port Arthur, but the Russians do have 3 cruisers and some smaller ships stationed at Vladivostok. The war broke out in February, when Vladivostok Harbor is iced over, but by April, these ships were on the move. And they proved a headache for the Japanese, who have to focus the bulk of their increasingly stretched navy on Port Arthur. The Japanese had a squadron of their own cruisers whose job it was to keep an eye on Vladivostok. This squadron was under the command of Admiral Kamimuro Hikonojo. But during the spring and summer, the Vladivostok Squadron would slip away from Kamimura several times and wreak havoc on Japanese shipping. Their most famous success was on June 15th in the Tsushima Straits, where the Russians would sink 2 transports and disable a third. Aside from the lives of over 1,300 Japanese soldiers and sailors, this attack would cost the Japanese 18 beautiful Krupp 11-inch siege guns that they were hoping to use against Port Arthur. And remember what I said last week about Russian track gauge? Now that the Japanese control Dalny and are shipping supplies to their soldiers through that port, they're going to need to start using that Russian rail line, the Chinese Southern Railway. Now, if the Japanese military command are anything, they are brilliant planners. They had foreseen the track gauge problem and had addressed it by ordering up a few custom-built locomotives from the United States designed to run on Russian tracks. Unfortunately, all this brilliant planning was for naught, as these precious locomotives were among the supplies being shipped that night, and they are now at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. The Japanese now had no choice but to rebuild the rail line to the Japanese gauge, a time-consuming task. To help alleviate the supply problems this created, they also began work on a new rail line northwest from Korea. As for Admiral Kamimura, some of the more conservative elements among the Japanese elite were about ready to hand him a sword and suggest that it was time for him to do the honorable thing. On the Liaodong Peninsula, the Japanese are now fighting a true front war. To the south, the Russians have withdrawn into Port Arthur. To the north, Kuropatkin is still at his headquarters in Liaoyang, still biding his time and waiting for more reinforcements. I mentioned that the Viceroy, Alexeyev, got out of Port Arthur on the last train before the Japanese cut the line. He took the train to Liaoyang, where he proceeded to set up shop and begin to criticize Kuropatkin's cautious approach. Remember what I said about his appointment as Viceroy muddying up the chain of command? Yeah, Well, at least he's out of Port Arthur, and he can't muck up the chain of command in two places at once, right? Wrong. Before he left Port Arthur, the Viceroy appointed Admiral Wittgeft to command the Pacific Squadron, as I already mentioned. Command of the Port Arthur land defenses had been in the hands of General Anatoly Mikhailovich Stessel. Before he left town, the Viceroy promoted General Stessel to the command of the entire military district and assigned his subordinate, Lieutenant General Konstantin Nikolaevich Smirnov, the task of defending Port Arthur itself. But, following the withdrawal from Nanshan, Stessel withdrew all forces to Port Arthur. We're now in a situation where Port Arthur is all that's left of the military district, which means it's kind of unclear who's in charge of it. Or maybe it's unclear to you and me, but not to Stessel. To him it was perfectly clear that he was in charge. After all, he outranked Smirnov. And defense of the port was a subsidiary responsibility to defense of the military district, right? But this wasn't the way Kuropatkin saw it. Kuropatkin flat out ordered Stessel to leave the defense of Port Arthur in the hands of Smirnov, and Stessel flat out disobeyed these orders. He would look over Smirnov's shoulder, criticizing and second-guessing his every move, countermanding his orders whenever he saw fit, and blaming everything that went wrong as a result on Smirnov. But this two-front thing isn't so good for the Japanese. Remember that the goal of the war is to push the Russians out of Manchuria. Capturing Port Arthur would be a terrific means to reach that end, but let's keep our eye on the ball here. What the Second Army needs to do is march north and link up with the First Army coming out of Korea. But what do we do about Port Arthur? The Japanese had an answer to that question, and his name was Nogi Marasuke. He was the son of a samurai and a respected general officer in the Japanese army. In 1894, Nogi was in command of the infantry brigade that took Port Arthur from the Chinese in one day. To send Nogi back 10 years later, this time in command of the Japanese Third Army, assigned the task of capturing Port Arthur all over again, seemed beautifully poetic. Which is appropriate because besides his military reputation, Nogi was known for his kanshi, a very old form of poetry that uses Chinese characters. Sadly, upon his arrival in Dalny in June 1904, Nogi's first expression of his literary gifts was a poem commemorating the bloody Battle of Nanshan, where one of the Japanese soldiers who was killed was the general's eldest son. Over the weeks that followed, the Third Army debarked at Dalny, and Nogi ordered them south to begin tightening the noose around Port Arthur. The death of his eldest son was a tragedy, but Nogi was still regarded as the Army's lucky charm. The man who had taken Port Arthur in 1894, with no muss and no fuss, could surely do it again. Of course, under Russian administration, the defenses around Port Arthur have been beefed up to the point where it is now one of the most heavily defended locations on the earth. But hey, it's General Nogi, am I right? Let's put that aside for a moment and take a look at the other front. The Second Army is now advancing north along the peninsula. Meanwhile, up in Liaodong, as I had mentioned before, there was the conflict between the Viceroy, Alexeyev, and the general, Kuropatkin. Kuropatkin was still waiting for reinforcements. Alexeyev thought that was outrageous and that Kuropatkin should take the offensive and strike south immediately to reopen communication to Port Arthur. Kuropatkin was not taking orders from the Viceroy. The Viceroy telegraphed to the Emperor. The Emperor and his council met, decided the Viceroy was right, and ordered Kuropatkin to move south. Kuropatkin sent a force south with instructions to retake Nanshan. It seems the Russians assumed that the Japanese Second Army had landed for the purpose of attacking Port Arthur, and it never entered their minds that the Japanese might be advancing north as well as south. And so the two forces met at a Chinese village called Delishu. The surprised Russian forces were outflanked and nearly routed. Only the timely arrival of a downpour saved them. The Japanese might have been more in a mood to celebrate had the Battle of Delisu not happened on the very same day, June 15th, as that attack by the Vladivostok Squadron in the Tsushima Straits that had cost them so much in men and equipment. The success of the Vladivostok Squadron made for really uncomfortable comparisons with the do-nothing approach of Admiral Wittgeft at Port Arthur. The Emperor had had enough, and he ordered the Admiral to take the Pacific Squadron out of Port Arthur and head for Vladivostok. Wittgeft planned to leave Port Arthur on June 20th, until he saw the news of his impending secret departure plastered across the front page of the Port Arthur newspaper, which forced him to postpone. The Pacific Fleet finally did make an attempt to leave Port Arthur on June 23rd, but Togo and his fleet were right there and chased him back into the harbor. That kept the Emperor quiet for a while, but by August the Japanese were shelling the land defenses of Port Arthur, at which point Nikolai began to fear for the safety of the Pacific Squadron against possible artillery attacks from the land. So the Emperor ordered Wittgeft to try again. At the same time, the Vladivostok Squadron was ordered south in the hope that the two squadrons could link up somewhere in the Sea of Japan after the Pacific Squadron cleared Port Arthur, and then proceed together to Vladivostok, which, by all appearances, was a better place from which to raid Japanese shipping. Not to mention the whole not being under siege thing. On August 10th, Wittgeft made his move. Commanding the squadron from the battleship Cesarevich, the admiral led the squadron out of Port Arthur at dawn. At first, Togo hung back and allowed the Russians to proceed. But by afternoon, he started coming up behind them, the combined fleet now placing itself between Wittgeft and Port Arthur. Apparently, Togo had had enough of playing cat and mouse, and meant to prevent the Russians from returning to the port. By mid-afternoon, it became apparent that the Russians were not going to turn around and go back to the port, but were breaking out and heading for Vladivostok. Togo hurried his fleet forward to close the distance. The battleships of the two fleets pounded each other for the rest of the afternoon, but no decisive hits were scored. It was beginning to look like the Pacific Squadron might be able to make it until sunset, when they would have a chance to slip away from Togo in the dark. But then, the Japanese scored multiple hits on the bridge of Cesarevich, killing everyone there, including the admiral and his staff. The ship's steering mechanism was jammed, some accounts say by the body parts of the casualties, and Cesarevich began making a hard port turn. In those days, naval fleets usually moved in single-file formation, as they did in this case with Cesarevich up front. The next ship behind in the line was Retvizan. She did not understand what had happened and thought that Cesarevich was maneuvering in response to the Japanese fire, so her captain ordered her to make a port turn of her own. But Cesarevich turned and turned and turned until it was now threatening to collide with the battleships behind it, and the awful truth was becoming apparent. But it took some time for command aboard Cesarevich to be reestablished, and then the next step was to advise the second-in-command aboard the battleship Peresviet the unwelcome news that he was now in command. The reason I say this news was unwelcome was that Peresviet had taken a few hits of its own. Both of its masts were down, which made it difficult to fly the signal flags needed to communicate to the rest of the fleet the order to turn around and head back to Port Arthur. Cesarevich and 3 Russian destroyers were able to limp their way to the German concession port of Qingdao, where they were interned for the remainder of the war. Other Russian ships ended up interned by the Chinese and by the French in Indochina. The portion of the Pacific Squadron that did make it back to Port Arthur would never sortie again. The Vladivostok Squadron, by the way, was steaming south to meet up with the Pacific Squadron. They got as far as the Tsushima Straits, and, not seeing any sign of the Pacific Squadron, got nervous and turned around to head for home. Unfortunately for them, Admiral Kamimura's squadron had spotted them and was coming in from the north at dawn, between them and Vladivostok, a perfect attack position. The two forces pounded each other. By the end of the battle, the crew of one cruiser were forced to scuttle their ship, while the other two Russian cruisers limped back to Vladivostok with heavier damage than the facilities there could repair. It was the end of the Vladivostok Squadron's run, and Admiral Kamimura got his honor back. We'll have to stop there for today, but I hope you'll join me next week on the history of the 20th century as the Japanese tighten the noose around Port Arthur. The bad news is, this fighting will provide plenty of inspiration for General Nogi's next poem. That's next week on the history of the 20th century. If you like the history of the 20th century, why not follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook? Visit our website, historyofthe20thcentury.com, where I'm going to post an explainer on where the title of this episode comes from. And while you're there, if you have a few bucks to spare, click on Donate and help support the show. Thanks to generosity of listeners like you, I'm using a brand new microphone this week. Can you tell the difference? Let me know how it sounds at historyofthe20thcentury@gmail.com. Oh, and one more thing. Admiral Wittgefst's final attempt to break out at Port Arthur, the one that cost him his life, is known to history as the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Strangely enough, one ship of the Pacific Squadron that was present at the battle that day, the cruiser Novik, actually did escape the Japanese blockade. Novik had been steaming at its best speed during the battle and was the farthest east of the Russian ships when the order came to turn around back to Port Arthur. Novik saw the order, but her commander judged that it would be suicide to reverse course and have to run the gauntlet of the entire Japanese combined fleet. So Novik continued east, intending to proceed to Vladivostok. The Japanese presence in the straits was too strong for Novik to proceed directly into the Sea of Japan and link up with the Vladivostok Squadron, so she made a daring effort to circle east of the Japanese home islands. Novik then turned north and cruised for 8 days. She did not have enough coal to reach Vladivostok, but the crew collected scrap wood, cloth, anything else that burned, and threw it all into the fires to keep the ship moving. She managed to make it to the small Russian settlement of Fort Korsakovsky on the southern shore of Sakhalin Island, which the Russians were using as a penal colony. She refueled there, but unfortunately the Japanese had spotted her approach to the port, and as she attempted to depart, she was attacked. After taking heavy damage, the crew of Novik managed to turn her around and return to Fort Korsakovsky, where they scuttled her. But the crew still meant to complete their journey to Vladivostok. This entailed a 6-week hike along most of the length of Sakhalin Island, about 400 miles, through lands inhabited by the indigenous Ainu people and largely unexplored by Russians. When they reached the narrow strait between Sakhalin and mainland Siberia, they got a ride from a steamer, then took a riverboat up the Amur River to Khabarovsk, and finally the Trans-Siberian Railroad. All 278 officers and crew who had survived the Japanese attacks made it safely to Vladivostok, arriving on October 23, 1904, just as winter was setting in, becoming the only crew in the Pacific Squadron to complete the voyage to Vladivostok, albeit without their ship. As for the Novik herself, the Japanese would salvage the scuttled ship in 1905, and she would be recommissioned into the Japanese Navy as Suzuya in 1906. She would finally be scrapped in 1913.